Hello, and welcome to VarnVlog Solo, where we talk about um, Plato's Republics, books 8, 9, and 10, finishing off the classic books. While I have terrible hair, excuse me. All right. So let's with that aside. Let's get into book um 8 just a little bit. So in book 8, Plato really wants to illustrate what happens when intellectual lawlessness breaks out of the spheres of elite discourse and the tutor student relationship and into the architecture of the state. This is where the transition that Aristotle also focuses on himself about in the politics happens. You also see this in Proclus, and that is a political transition from democracy to tyranny. Now, it's also important to remember that Plato saw something like this at the resolution of the Peloponnesian War, when an oligarchy was established with his own relatives and some of Socrates' students being implicated by Sparta and Athens, and then the demagogic response to that. But because of Plato's geometric logic, it seems like he thinks that the consequences that we see that disorder the individual psyche also disorders the state. And these classes that you saw, meaning that he discussed at the end of book 2 and the reason for banning the poets, and I mean not book 2, book VII, and the reason for banning the poets and everything, we see that it expands out. In short, when the dialectic is impossible, and again, remember, Plato's dialectic is not like Hegel's dialectic, and it's definitely not Marx's dialectic, but it is what he sees as the answer here. When dialectic dialogue for objective truth goes away, weaponized rhetoric of heuristic self-interest comes in to fill the gap, and that causes institutions to implode. So in book 7, which we already talked about, Socrates warned that immature minds treat the dialectic as a game of contradiction and destroying traditional norms and leaving a moral vacuum. This is why he advised against anyone younger than 30 really be allowed to study the dialectic. In book 8, this manifests as a defining characteristic of the democratic state, which is an absolute undisciplined relativism, because there's no standard of excellence to hold things together. Because the democratic city-state declares all values and lifestyles completely equal, it loses a capacity to distinguish between virtue and vice, since the form of the good is not manifested through any objective virtues. The intellectual lawlessness first changes public language. And a somewhat famous passage from this book, and I'm going to stick with the English terms for this because it's still pretty clear. Technically, some of these meanings are slightly different in Greek, but we'll go with it. Plato describes how a democratic society has a semantic inversion, which is used to legitimize a lack of restraint in the general populace and in leaders. So he says, insolence becomes mistaken and renamed good breeding. Anarchy gets renamed freedom. Extravagance is rebranded as magnificence instead of garish and garish pomp and circumstance. And shamelessness is confused for courage. For Plato, this is a political and linguistic manifestation of the eristic impulse. Language is no longer a tool used by the by the rational ruling class to discover truth or maintain civic health. It is just weaponized to justify physical impulses to protect the ego from any form of moral or intellectual authority. For Plato, this leads to the destruction of authority. And this causes a social impasse. Just as the immature dialectician loses all respect for his foster parents, which is, the truth. The democratic synodry loses all respect for any form of authority, any hierarchical or structural order, and any natural historical authority based on talent or merit. So, how does Plato see this? Plato notes that the insatiable desire for unconstrained liberty trickles down into every domestic relationship, which creates social friction between parents and children, between teachers and students, and between citizens and resident aliens, immigrants, and slaves, as well as full citizens. In the case of the family, fathers condition themselves to become like children, fearing their sons, while sons neither feel shame nor fear their parents in the name of an absolute independence, thus leading to a breakdown in traditional authority. Teachers flatter and fear their pupils, while their pupils treat their instructors with contempt because they are not acting with any authority. And I'll speak to this one. I actually find this to be true. The more that you flatter your pupils, the more contemptuous they often are of you, even though they might like you superficially more in the beginning of the relationship. I find this part actually does resonate with me. Now, I don't have the same ideas of natural hierarchy as Plato, but nonetheless. And then the resident alien, the immigrant, and the full citizen are viewed as completely indistinguishable and possible political authority, as well as, the different kinds of citizens are viewed as indistinguishable. And Plato goes so far as to have Socrates implicate that domestic animals can even catch this disease of lawlessness. Horses and donkeys will march down the street with total entitlement, bumping into anyone who doesn't yield the road to them. This is how Plato thinks about this. It's literally cats and dogs raining from the sky almost in this metaphor. Society becomes so hypersensitive to any form of restraint that the mere suggestion of institutional duty or legal limitation is rejected as tyrannical, according to Plato here. The political consequences of this, according to Plato, is the rise of demagoguery. The total lack of structural grounding leaves the domestic state with a wide opening for a coup, because the citizenry has been trained to believe the truth is whatever the most immediately appealing fiction is, which is a sophistic victory, according to Plato. They're completely defenseless against eristic bad actors, such as demagogues. The demagogue doesn't lead the populace towards the light of the sun. He studies the appetites of the great beasts of the public crowd and feeds them what they crave, and then uses it against the crowd. He stands up at the assembly, stirs up class warfare by accusing the wealthy of oligarchy, promises to redistribute property, but then seizes most of the property for himself, according to Plato. When the wealthy naturally resist, the demagogue uses their resistance to stoke public paranoia. He claims that his life is in danger because he's fighting for the people's freedom. The undisciplined clown, having long since discarded the rational capacity to look past appearances to structural outcomes, will grant him a personal paramilitary bodyguard, thus giving up their liberties as well as the liberties of the people that they were aiming for the demagogue to take away. With that act of intellectual and political surrender, everything starts to fall apart. The champion uses his guard to eliminate political rivals, to purge the city of anyone wise or brave enough to challenge him, and transform the hyper-free democracy into an absolute terror-driven prison. The slide into intellectual lawlessness is complete here. The city that refuses to be ruled by the absolute truth of reason ends up enslaved by the absolute whim of whoever has the best heuristic capacity of speech and the most force. At least that's according to Plato. You can hear how conservative this is. When people try to read Plato as liberal, as progressive or conservative, I think one is struck with how radically against Athenian society he's willing to go, and yet also how aristocratic he is and what he fears about the empowerment of the public. He thinks that empowering the public to freedom actually leads to the exact opposite, and it's bad for everybody. So this brings us to Book IX, which is a culmination. This actually does go back to Book II. So Socrates delivers his final definitive answer to Glaucon and Adeimantus, because he tries to deal with the interlife of a tyrant and arguing that the tyrant is not happy. And let's go back and remember what the question was. Is an unjust man truly happier than a just man if he has absolute power and a flawless reputation? So Socrates sets out to say the archetype of absolute injustice is actually the most miserable enslaved creature on the planet. And he divides this into three major phases: the psychology of the tyrant, the three proofs of the philosopher's superior happiness, and the famous image of the three-part beast. And remember, this tripartite metaphor keeps on coming up. Plato likes threes to illustrate points, and he sees them as paralleling each other over and over and over again. You have the tripartite soul. You have the three metals in the myth and the noble lie. You have the three periods of philosophers, superior happiness, and the image of the tripartite beast. So Socrates begins Book IX by examining how the tyrannical individual develops. He builds on Book IV's tripartite soul model by looking at what happens to our appetites, or the epithymeticon. And he does this about when we sleep. Socrates argues that every human being harbors a dark, lawless, underbelly desire that normally only surfaces in dreams. This is the desire for incest, for murder, for taboo acts. In a healthy person, these monsters stay locked up, but the lawless appetites are there. The tyrannical man is someone through the bad company and lack of discipline allows his waking life to be governed entirely by these dream monsters, according to Plato Socrates. A singular ravenous monster passion, which Plato actually explicitly calls a tyrannical form of eros, seizes control of the tyrant's mind. So this is erotic, but also grotesque, at least for Plato. To feed this beast, the tyrannical man squanders his wealth, robs his parents, breaks into temples, betrays his friends. He's a slave to his own addictions and is constantly isolating himself, and in isolating himself, also making his eristic appetites easier to act on and push out. He becomes a slave to his own addictions and his own predilections and his own hatred, according to Socrates. And this is actually maintained. The Stoics pick this up as well. So when such an individual sees his actual political power of the city, his internal misery is magnified on a massive scale. He basically uses the city almost as a body of his own psychic turmoil. Socrates asks Glaucon to look at the glitz of the tyrant's palace. And then he says that if you look at it closely, you can see that the tyrant is actually terrified most of the time because he has enslaved and murdered so many of his equals. He is surrounded by people who want to kill him. He is trapped in a palace like a prison, unable to travel or enjoy the world, perpetually paranoid, increasingly friendless despite all the supplication, and rotting from the inside out. He contrasts this with the three proofs of happiness in Book IX. To formally resolve the dialogue's central question, though, it isn't good enough to just prove that the tyrant is unhappy. You must also prove that the hated just man, our philosopher, is also happy. Socrates presents three distinct arguments to prove that the aristocratic, philosophical, but not warrior life is inherently happier than the tyrannical life. So, just as a tyrannical city is the most miserable and impoverished in a slave state, according to Plato Socrates, the aristocratic city is the happiest and most free, corresponding with the corresponding souls share the same fate. and they are all taken care of in their place. The philosopher's soul is free and harmonious. The tyrant's soul is chaotic. Thus, the balance of the classes that maintains a harmonious society is turned into an impoverished war zone. But this logic of the manifestation holds for Socrates. If someone is manifesting this way, the outer world and the inner world must reflect each other. Now, we can disagree with this as an actually valid argument, but it is part of the geometric logic of which Socrates is employing, or Plato is having Socrates employ. Socrates thus divides the human being into three archetypes based on what they love. There is the lover of wisdom, the philosopher, the lover of honor, the timocrat, and the lover of profit, the oligarch, or the tyrant, depending. Each claims their own life is best, but Socrates argues that only the philosopher is qualified to judge because only the philosopher has experienced all three types of pleasure. The philosophy has experienced the pleasure of appetite because he grew up eating and drinking and satisfying his needs like everyone else, knowing when to do so appropriately and knowing when to starve them off. This philosopher has experienced the pride of praise and honor because he has done things civically that are good, and in doing so has been praised and has honor form of this, thus beginning to develop the spiritedness of a warrior. But only the philosopher, according to Plato, Socrates, has tasted the supreme pleasure of contemplating the objective reality in the form of the good. So only the philosopher has reason and the ability to see the form of the good. Now, the logic of this is different than Aristotle, but the conclusion is actually very similar. Remember, Aristotle's human theology is manifested in the ability to reason, and reason is social, so the social reasoning manifests in certain ways, but also for Aristotle, the philosopher is the ultimate teleological person because he's perfected both reason and sociality to the extent that it is his being and he can contemplate it. It's very similar to Plato in its outcome, but very different in the logic that Aristotle uses to get there. Anyway, so this last experience of the pleasure of contemplating objective reason in the form of the good also makes philosopher the only person who can actually make rational judgments and rational arguments, and thus the only person to decide whether or not they're actually happy in their own lifetime. For everyone else, we have to wait till they're dead. Also comes up in Aristotle from Herodotus. Then you get the metaphysical argument on the nature of pleasure from Socrates, or at least Plato-Socrates anyway. So Socrates argues that the physical pleasures like eating when hungry are not true pleasures. They are merely temporary removals of pain. And thus, as temporary removals of pain, they are unstable and fleeting. The pleasures of the mind, which grasp unchanging and unchangeable eternal truths, fill the soul with things that possess genuine being. They are ontologically real. And because they are unchanging, the philosopher enjoys a deep, stable, and true pleasure because that pleasure is based on something that is beyond the physical world and beyond change. The tyrant chases phantom pleasures, trying to fill an insatiable leaky bucket with all kinds of sensory experiences that can never truly be filled because the nature of the physical world is inconsistent. Socrates thus calculates, and he does this with math as almost a joke, the exact distance between the happiness of a true king and the misery of a tyrant, concluding that the philosopher lives exactly 729 times more pleasantly than the tyrant. 729 is actually an interesting number here because it's 9 to the third power, a number Plato links to the days of the week and nights of the year, and also to the various tripartite functions that we've been seeing coming up over and over again, because Plato, like a lot of ancient texts and a lot of ancient religious texts, likes number games. He ends with the three-part beast. To visualize the victory over Thrasymachus's argument, Socrates instructs Glaucon to construct the mental state of the human soul. He creates an unforgivable composite image. There is the logisticon, which is a human being. The lion, which is fierce and powerful, and the many-headed monster, which is wild, unstable, and shifting like a hydra. The first represents reason, the logisticon. The second represents spirit, or the moody Epiphanides, or the holder of thumos, or the spiritedness. And then the latter represents the epithymeticon, are the insatiable nature of appetites. The many-headed monster is a wild beast with a mixture of wild and tame animal heads that can change at will, making its nature unstable and inconstant. The lion is fierce and proud and full of spirit and an actual powerful creature, but also is still roughly a beast. And the human being is smaller but rational and can use that rationality to conquer both the lion and the many-headed monster. Plato says that you must cease to see the three creatures. Plato says that you must cease to see the three creatures as separate because they all exist in a single outer shell that looks like a normal human being. So the observer only sees a single man. When a person practices injustice, they are starving and weakening the image human being while feeding and strengthening the many-headed monster. The lion and the monster will tear each other apart in a violent civil war within the person, dragging the helpless inner man along. When a person practices justice, the inner man holds the reins. He tames the many-headed beast without killing it, like a good farmer does, making an ally out of the lion, and ensures all three parts care for each other so that they are maintained in a harmony. This is where we get ramping up to the final book. Glaucon notes at the very end, in what sounds like something almost sad, that the Kallipolis, or the perfectly dressed city, exists nowhere. It doesn't exist on Earth. And then Socrates delivers a conclusion. It doesn't need to exist on Earth. A blueprint of the city is laid up in heaven as the form of the good city. The Kallipolis is a reflection of the form for anyone who wants to see it, and they can already see it within themselves because they already know it. You need to see the Timaeus, and the Timaeus is a kind of epistemology where all knowledge, even from the slave boy, is already known. It just needs to be uncovered by tutoring. The true philosopher live according to the laws that the heavenly city alone, regardless of the actual city they live in, because the true philosopher also has knowledge of the forms and can make the world more close to the forms through their philosophizing. Yeah, it makes that Marx line on Feuerbach actually make a little bit of sense, although Marx wouldn't agree with like 99% of what's in the Republic, but there is something at stake here. This brings us to the last book in the myth of which is also kind of on its own interesting thing. The Republic reaches an absolute conclusion by circling back to two unresolved issues: the eviction of the dramatic poets and the cosmic stakes of justice. Having already proven in Book IV that the just man is happier than the unjust man in this life, Socrates wants to extend this out towards eternity. Now, you can reject his proofs. I do, actually, personally. I don't think Book IV is particularly convincing. But he, again, turns to myth. Now, as I've said, one of the reasons almost explicitly stated in the Republic that he wants to get rid of the poets is they compete for the mythic mind. You can't have a noble lie that's stable if you got poets making up noble lies that are unstable. And maybe not all that noble from Socrates' perspective, or thus Plato's. So Socrates talks about the myth of which is a cosmic vision of the afterlife that ties everything together, both linking the political, the moral or psychological, and the metaphysical elements of this argument. So Socrates begins Book X by defending his decision to exile all the poets from the Kallipolis. Armed with the metaphysical theories developed in Books VI and VII, which is the divided line in the allegory of the cave, he launches a devastating critique of artistic representation, coming back to that issue around mimesis, but doing it in a more sustained way, framing it as an intellectual and psychological prison. Plato argues that artistic imitation is 3 steps removed from reality. He uses the famous example of a coach. God creating an eternal, unchanging abstract form of the coach, which is the idea, and this is part of the ultimate reality. A carpenter uses their mind to build a specific physical wooden coach or couch based on the form, and this is a copy of the ultimate reality, and it has particularities. An artist or poet paints a picture or writes a description of the carpenter's couch or coach. They don't understand carpentry or the form. They merely capture a single deceptive angle of a physical copy of the ideal form. Now, note, you have to accept the concept that ideal forms are real for also every single thing in possible existence for this to make any sense. But if you do, you get this three-part movement. And again, notice Plato's use of threes. This geometric and numerical thing is really important to notice. Therefore, a poet, let's say Homer or Hesiod, possesses no true knowledge, episteme, of the things they are writing about, whether it is warfare, governments, or virtue. They are merely illusionists peddling shadows to the lowest and most uneducated parts of the mind. Now, Plato doesn't have an answer if the poet is also a carpenter or Homer also a warrior. He doesn't deal with that and doesn't want you to ask him that question, and thus doesn't have it asked in the dialogue. But nonetheless, this is his conception here. So the real danger of poetry is just moral or psychological. Dramatic tragedy thrives on emotional voluntarity. It coaxes audience into weeping, self-pity, and grief. Behaviors that a just person would rigorously suppress using reason. By feeding these appetitive and spirited parts of the psyche under the guise of entertainment, poetry actively deconstructs harmony, which was supposed to be set out in Book IV. It acts as an internal mental coup, dethroning reason. Socrates thus concludes that until poetry can mount a rational philosophical defense of itself in prose, it must be exiled. So he really wants to get rid of the poets. Before introducing the afterlife, Socrates drops a brief logical proof for the immortality of the soul. In Book X, this is part of why Christians like this book, he argues that everything has a specific natural evil that destroys it. That rot destroys wood, that rust destroys iron, that disease destroys the body. You can see a very ancient logic here. Rust doesn't actually destroy wood. It's a development of oxidation. Disease do destroy the body, but it's not one thing. And rot does destroy wood, but it itself is a sign of other problems. But nonetheless, this is not the way they thought in Plato's time, so it doesn't come up. The natural evils of the soul, thus, are vice and injustice, cowardice, ignorance, licentiousness, etc. However, unlike disease, injustice does not physically kill or even dissolve the soul. In fact, the completely unjust tyrant often radiates a predatory, vivacious energy. If the soul cannot be destroyed by its own internal disease, like the body can be destroyed by its own internal disease, Plato concludes, or Socrates concludes, that the soul must be immortal. Now, it takes about 30 seconds to put a hole in this argument, but nonetheless. Then he finishes the Republic with the myth of So to illustrate what happens to the immortal soul, Socrates relates the myth of the story of which was a brave Pamphylian soldier who died in battle. 12 days after his death, while lying on his own funeral pyre, wakes up and reveals that he has witnessed the underworld. He is chosen by the judges to be the messenger to mankind and sent back to describe the mechanics of cosmic justice. Thus describes cosmic justice as a sorting house where souls are judged. The just are sent upwards into a beautiful heavenly realm for thousands of years of joy, while the unjust are sent downward into the earth to experience 1,000 years of agonizing tenfold punishment for their crimes. This sounds like Christianity or even Buddhism's cycles of samsara or something like that. It's probably a reason for that. This idea shows up in a lot of Indo-European thought. At the center of the universe hangs the spindle of necessity, which is a massive cosmic mechanism composed of concentric spinning wheels that represent planetary spheres. The three fates turn the spindle, singing of the past, the present, and the future, while the souls gather before them to prepare for reincarnation. And again, you see this theme of threes. I cannot emphasize enough. This is all over this end of the Republic. So this actually leads to a lottery. This is where the myth explicitly locks together the political and the moral or psychological arguments of this entire set of books. The souls are not assigned their next lives by fate. Instead, the fate Lachesis, throws down a random lottery number to establish the order in which they will choose their next incarnation. Spread out over the ground before them are thousands of sample humans and animal lives, from tyrants and athletes, paupers, commoners, kings. The person who drew the very first lot runs forward greedily and chooses the greatest, most absolute tyranny available. He is blinded by his past habits and untamed appetites, and only after choosing does he look closely and realize the horror that his chosen life contains the fate of eating his own children. He bursts into tears, blaming fate and the gods rather than his own choice of running for what seemed to be good without really knowing everything contained. Crucially, Eyre notes that this greedy soul had lived his previous life in a well-ordered, just city, practicing virtue by habit and social conformity rather than by philosophical understanding. So he had the benefit of the philosophical worldview, but he didn't internalize it. Lacking this analytical capacity that is found in the dialectic, he is completely unable to judge the structural outcome of an unjust life under pressure. The very last lot belongs to the soul of Odysseus. Weary of his past ambitions, fame, and hardships, if you know the story of the Iliad Odyssey, you know all about Odysseus's ambitions, fame, and hardship. He spends the last hour searching the ground for a life that everyone else has discarded, a quiet, obscure life of a private, ordinary man with his mind on his own business. When he finds it, he chooses it happily, stating he would have done the same had he drawn the first lot because he remembers his prior life. The myth of does a lot of work here. It serves as Plato's final absolute refutation of Thrasymachus and the doubts of Glaucon and the arguments of the sophists by weaving together all the themes at once. The lottery demonstrates that practical common sense, structural habit, and rhetorical skill are useless when the soul is stripped of social constraints. The person who practices virtue merely because the law tells them to do so is completely defenseless when given the choice of the ring of Gyges or some new incarnation that's going to have bad outcomes. The philosopher who has climbed through the divided line, going through the various steps out of doxa and into gnosis, understands why justice is structurally good for the soul as well as for the city, and can look past the glaring facade of the tyrant's life to see all of the problems that are hidden within it. The spindle of necessity reveals that the universe is governed by the exact same mathematical harmony and geometric balance and structural specialization that Socrates used to build the Kallipolis in the first place, and which makes the rhyming levels between the tripartite soul and the tripartite city and the ultimate nations of justice and the three-headed beast and all these threes that come up over and over again are all deliberately set up because justice is not a temporary social contract invented by the weak or just something enforced by the strong. It is a law of the cosmos reflected in numerical precision. Hence, Socrates and Plato's love of numbers coming out. Before the choosing of lives begins, the prophet of Lachesis, I have no idea how you say that name. It's one of the fates. Delivers the ultimate last line of the dialogue. Blame is his who chooses. God is blameless. Virtue has no master. By ending with the soul's drinking from the river of forgetfulness before being shot like shooting stars into new bursts, So they drink from the lithy, by the way, in this myth. Plato tells Glaucon that our choices in this life echo across eternity. It almost sounds like Buddhism. There's so much actually in this that struck me as like, wow, this is a parallel to Buddhist thought, but has a completely different metaphysics because, or maybe a parallel to Vedantic thought or something like that. But the reason why I say it has a completely different metaphysics is like Buddhists would absolutely say that the nature of reality is completely shifting and being is not eternal. But they would still go through a lot of these other metaphors. So the true philosopher king isn't just a philosopher who's balanced his own inner life. He isn't just a person who can manage a city-state. They are an autonomous soul who has permanently cured their own internal psychological architecture, ensuring that whatever they are inside the cave, are ruling a state, are standing before the fates, they will choose the path of justice and reason because they can see the form of the good in the absolute truth. And here we end with Plato's Republic. Now, we will notice how idealist this might sound to us today. We don't share this metaphysics, and we have different notions of math in a lot of ways too. This like simple geometric pairing and symmetry is not assumed in modern math. But you can see a lot of where Plato's assumptions go, and you can also see how this is almost impossible to put on a modern political spectrum. Is it reactionary? Yes. Is it progressive compared to other Athenian norms by modern standards? Absolutely yes. Is it authoritarian? Yes. Is it concerned with the freedom of individuals, even of slaves? Yes. Although it also accepts that people are naturally of types, and those types are unalterable. Although just being born to one type does not mean you stay in that type. You might have another kind of soul, but it's not because you made yourself better. It's because you were better and you discovered it. Plato's arguments here can also frustrate us because they're based on assuming his metaphysical axioms as well as accepting that his myths make sense and are valid constructions of logical principles, which in certain simple cases they were, but it's not hard to see how one can pick this apart. Now, this is the first of 3 of the major political works of Plato. Like I said, politics shows up in a lot of Plato's work. It definitely shows up in the Apologia for Socrates. It shows up in some of the early dialogues too, but it becomes more and more of his ideal state, and it doesn't map on to modern politics that well. We're going to talk about, though, how this text has perplexed people for a long, long time. I'm giving you kind of a direct summary from my reading of the text itself and about 4 secondary sources, which I scripted out over the course of a month. And I have been thinking a lot about this, and I do think we're going to take a brief break to go over the other, some other topics, because I don't want to just be doing the ancient world forever. I will come back to this, though, because I promised to do the other 2 major political works, the Statesman and the Laws. And I also want to go over the interpretive history of these texts, particularly the Republic, where there's a lot more interpretive history. And the reasons for that are complicated. But I do think, everything I've said today is like more or less considered to be a consensus view of the meaning of these individual books, but every element of it can be contested and have been over time, and different meanings have been derived from this text. And so to understand the Republic today, we actually need to understand the way different groups throughout Western history have tried to understand this text, going all the way back to fairly contemporaneous to Plato to up into the current day. So we're going to take a break, talk about a few other topics, but we'll come back and handle this in that way. If you like this kind of thing, subscribe. I am beginning to interview more specialists on this period of philosophy, and we'll be doing a lot more philosophical interviews tied in with all the other stuff we do here. The polemical elements of the solos are only really for me to teach you things so you can start figuring out how to respond and organize and come up with political judgments beyond being a mere fan. That's the important part. You liking my work is not particularly political. I mean, I appreciate it. I'm flattered. definitely am flattered if you give me money, but that's not the point, really. Nor do I think I'm giving you the true, the beautiful, and the good, a la Plato's Philosopher King. I don't think I could do that even if I wanted to, but I don't want to either. No, what we're doing here is to get you to start thinking about things that get you beyond simple polemics, get you beyond just a cycle of hyper-political fandoms and response cycles and being manipulated by media fads and crushes. And to do that, you do need to have a relatively stable conception of the way everything can interact and the history of politics. If you're going to engage in politics, knowing where these ideas come from and not just getting caught up in whatever is going viral on one of the social media platforms is going to be important. Your job in some ways is to stand above and beyond. So aside from all that, I hope you take that away from me discussing these ancient things like Plato and the other polemics that I do. The polemics are, like I said, they're pedagogical. They get you to think about things in the way that they manifest in your own life, not necessarily just to convince you to agree with me. Many of you won't, and that's fine and probably natural and good. So on that note, if you want more, there's more behind a paywall. The paywall is relatively inexpensive. You can find me at Patreon/VarnVlog, and you can get access for as little as $4. I also do seminars. They range in price between as little as $5 and as much as $50 so far. But I don't do this very often. And I also have a structure with them where eventually they'll be made to patrons for free. And the reading materials and the study guides and the scaffolding will be given away for everybody for free, usually 6 months after I do them. So you're not just supporting your own learning and me, you're also enabling me to give this out to the public and justifying the overhead to do that. If you really want to support the show, that's a good way. But if you don't want to take a class from me like that or do anything else like that, you can buy my book with Daniel Tutt. It's available from Rebranded Press, but it's also on Amazon and most booksellers. If you have a problem with Amazon, you don't have to buy it from there. I understand. And that can help me. And I also want to enlighten you about my position on left populism. Or you can just share this, get it out to the world. That's actually one of the biggest things you can do to help me out. So we're in on that. Protect your peace. Like and subscribe, hit the bell, and share, and leave a comment if you're so inclined. How do you feel going through this discussion of Plato? I know that I probably missed things you would have wanted me to talk about. Even giving each book approximately 20 minutes a piece doesn't really give you that much time to go as in depth as maybe you would want. And that's also going to be very true when we talk about the interpretive traditions. So feel free to correct me or add stuff that you think I missed or any of that. I'm not gonna get offended unless it's wrong. But there is all kinds of stuff that even I know I did not talk about in very much depth. So if you want to talk about that, talk in the show notes. That'll help me out too. Or I'm not show notes in the comments. And thank you for your support. Thank you for watching this series. You don't have to watch these in order, although it is a little bit easier if you watch the exegesis of the Republic in order, but you don't have to. Maybe you feel like you're only weak on a couple of these books, but you understand the more famous allegories. So coming in on the divided line, when you understand the allegory of the cave, makes sense, although that's in the same video, so you're not going to skip a video. But let's say you understand the Tracy Mackes chapter, but don't necessarily get all the high-end metaphors in the second half of the Republic. Well, you can skip episode 1. So feel free to do that. Protect your peace. Like and subscribe. Help me out if you found this valuable. And if you didn't, don't. I don't really care. If you didn't enjoy it, I didn't do it for you. Take care of yourself. Have a great day.